The middle of the 1920s were easily considered the golden age of the railways. The Big Four dominated the transport industry, offering luxury and affordability to passengers, and the increased movement of freight meant that more perishable goods such as fresh fish and dairy were more available to those inland and inner city. Likewise, city-made luxuries and manufactured goods were becoming more available to those living in the country. Life was good, but there was always room for improvement. George Beenies was born in 1892 and was the son of an engineer. He had a lot to live up to. His father, John, was co-owner of the Star Engineering Works, which specialised in passenger and luggage lifts. John passed away when George was only 13. The loss, however, didn't deter George, and even at an early age he began to follow in his family's footsteps. He had a brilliant mind, and even before his 20s had several patents and inventions under his belt. When George was 22, he enlisted in the army and served in France in the First Great War. He worked in the remount section, tending to the horses and mules, purchasing and training them. His mind, though, shone through, and later in the war, George was transferred to the Royal Flying Corps as an air mechanic. By the end of the war, he was proficient to be classed as a fitter for the new planes, working with them closely. After the war, George went back to Scotland to pursue his dreams of being an engineer. It was no doubt his time in the war had influenced his ideas. He knew that planes were the way of the future. They saved time getting passengers from A to B with no hold-ups, could go anywhere, and could move freight with ease. But passenger planes were new and could only carry up to 20 people at a time. Trains, on the other hand, were faster and could take hundreds of people at a time, but the railway network was swollen with freight. Freight was slow, long and cumbersome, and would hold up many a passenger service. George surmised that if a passenger train could be removed off the track and into the air, then there's no telling how fast the train could go. By merging the advantages of a plane with the advantages of a train, George patented a new type of railplane in 1921. The single carriage was suspended underneath a large monorail with twin propellers at the front and the back providing the motion. George made the monorail gantries so that they would straddle the existing railway underneath. By having the railway below them, George envisioned that the freight could use the slower ground level track, while passengers could be moved above it quickly and safely. It was a nice cost-effective move as well, as extra land was not required to be purchased. Only a small patch of concrete would need to be required to take the weight of the gantry supports. The railplane was designed with aerodynamics in mind, and it was theorised that the engine with its twin propellers could reach speeds of up to 125 miles per hour or more, and it could climb steeper hills, meaning that embankments and cuttings were not required to be dug. A lower rail stabilised the carriage, meaning that turns and curves would not require the carriage to swing or bank around them, and rubber wheels were introduced to the twin bogies that held the carriage aloft, reducing friction, noise and vibration. The interior of the railplane was not too dissimilar to the airships of the time. Rich carpeted flooring, large comfy armchairs and stained glass windows greeted the passengers as they boarded. George was excited when his proposed system won an Innovation Award in 1922 and turned several key backers' heads. And with the LNER's permission, he was able to get enough funding to build a 130-metre test track over one of the LNER's disused sidings at Burnbrae Works near Glasgow. George was sure that this was his greatest breakthrough, ready to revolutionise the transport industry. He envisioned his invention all around the world, taking passengers from city to city at breakneck speed, and introduced a swathe of excitement and posters with concept art, and even asked British Path, a well-renowned newsreel, to do a piece on the new train. In George's eyes, this was history in the making. But the investors, while excited, could not be convinced to part with their cash. The Great Depression had hit investors hard all around the world, and getting backing for any new concept around this time was near impossible. George, desperate to get more backing, travelled to America to try and get more investors, but it was not to be. The proposed lines between Edinburgh and Glasgow and Southport and Blackpool were never built, and the prototype remained still and silent in the yard, save for a few experiments. Facing crippling debts, George was forced to declare himself bankrupt in 1937, his invention and his dream in tatters. George was forced to leave the prototype to the elements and worked on smaller inventions, moving to London in 1939. He tried several times to propose the Railplane to the Big Four, but after the prototype's failure, none of them were willing to back any future plans. Sometime later, George abandoned his transport dream and went to open a herbalist shop, working quietly until he passed away in November of 1957. The Railplane amazingly managed to survive the Second World War, relatively unscathed, considering the need for metal. Its engines and propellers were removed, and the train lay quietly rusting away. Eventually, in 1956, old, decayed and rusted, the train was sold for scrap by the bank. It was torn down and smelted. The rails are long gone, and the area is now occupied by a timber mill. The only surviving part of the railway is the shed where the carriage was built. This is now the timber mill's office, but a plaque commemorating the Railplane sits proudly outside. Other than British Path newsreel, which can be seen online, the only other physical proof of the Railplane sits within the National Railway Museum's collections of photos and art in the museum's library. In the archives, there's a commemoration document outlining the past, the present and the future of rail travel. It's too delicate to be on public display, but it shows off the proud and confident George and his vision for the future. Even though he sadly didn't see much of it, many monorails have George to thank for leading the way in monorail design and proving that monorails can work. His invention may have failed, but his ideas do live on in monorails all around the world.